Welcome back. So what about the quiz? What's your best guess for the location of each of these? Here you may check whether you were right. It's quite an impressive diversity that is illustrated here, isn't it? I wish now to turn to Judaism and Jewish legal tradition. Judaism, everything is centered around monotheism, the belief in one God, everything, including legal science. Let me illustrate this by introducing Maimonides to you. Maimonides, Moshe ben Maimon in Hebrew or Musa bin Maimun in Arabic, grew up and lived in Islamic Spain in the 12th century, but later in his life fled to North Africa with his family due to political turmoil and religious persecutions in one of the troubled periods that interrupted the overall peaceful coexistence and fruitful interaction between the different communities in Islamic Spain. Eventually, he settled in Cairo, where he became the physician of the Sultan. Maimonides was an eminent philosopher, legal scholar, and physician. In all three fields of knowledge, he wrote extensive works in Hebrew and in Arabic. By many, he is regarded as the greatest Jewish philosopher and legal scholar of all times. The work he is best known for is Mishneh Torah, a comprehensive presentation of Jewish law and ethics, often referred to as the most authoritative codification of Jewish law and ethics. On the picture you can see an edition in 18 volumes. At the bottom of the slide you find a link to a free online version in English. In Book 1 of Mishneh Torah, entitled Book of Knowledge, Section 1 on the foundations of the Torah, Maimonides makes this statement: "The principle of all principles and the pillar of all sciences rests upon realizing that there is a first being and that it is this which gives existence to all that exists. All creatures of heaven, earth, and the space in between receive their being and their reality from his being." So monotheism is the starting point of all classical Jewish thought in every field of knowledge, including the field of law. This applies also to the classical Jewish perception of history. Let me give you a short overview. From a classical Jewish perspective, history begins with God creating the world, and the mythical time of creation, which corresponds to 3760 BC, is also the starting point of the Jewish calendar as codified by Maimonides in his Mishneh Torah. In Jewish biblical history, the origin of the people of Israel is referred back to Abraham, his son Isaac, and his grandson Jacob, the patriarchs or forefathers of the people of Israel. All three are also venerated by Christians and Muslims, especially Abraham, who is often regarded as the forefather of all three monotheistic world religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The Hebrew Bible tells the story of the children of Israel, the Israelites, living for generations in Egypt, where they ended up being enslaved and forced to labor on Egyptian construction sites before being liberated and led out of Egypt by Moses. Moses, Moshe in Hebrew, the leader of the people of Israel in its Exodus, is the most important prophet and the lawgiver in Judaism. According to the biblical account, God gave Moses the mission to save the Israelites from slavery, to lead them out of Egypt, and to bring them to Canaan, the promised land, a long journey across the desert. On the map you can see a representation of the stations on that journey. The station that in the Jewish tradition is by far the most significant and the most consequential on that journey is Mount Sinai. According to Jewish tradition, this is where Moses received the revelation of the law for his people, the Torah, both in its written and oral parts. It is also where the people of Israel accepted the Torah as their law given to them by God in what is referred to as the Sinai covenant. Let's have a look at a summary of the biblical account. Moses ascended Mount Sinai, and God spoke to him the following words. So shall you say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and I brought you to me. And now, if you obey me and keep my covenant, you shall be to me a treasure out of all peoples, for mine is the entire earth. And you shall be to me a kingdom of princes and a holy nation. Moses returned from Sinai and called for the elders of the people and put all these words of God before them. Unanimously, with one voice and one mind, the people answered, everything God has said, we will do. Thus they accepted the Torah outright with all its precepts, not even asking for a detailed enumeration of the obligations and duties it involved. Here you have what Jewish tradition refers to as the special relationship between God and his people. Here you have the basis for the people of Israel being identified as God's chosen people, but this is understood as conditional. It's subject to the condition of obeying God and keeping the covenant with him, of accepting and putting into practice God's law. And the biblical account emphasizes that the people of Israel, in its limitless loyalty, accepted that law outright, with all its precepts, not even asking for a detailed enumeration of the obligations and duties it involved. From a classical Jewish perspective, acceptance of the law is central to Jewish identity. It is the prerequisite for belonging to the Jewish community. This has changed somewhat in more recent times with the emergence of new perceptions of identity. But for centuries, loyalty to the Torah was what was required to remain Jewish. Rejecting the Torah meant giving up Jewish identity. As the biblical account goes on, Moses then ascended Mount Sinai again and stayed there for 40 days and nights in the immediate presence of God, which he alone was able to bear, receiving the revelations of the entire Torah. The Hebrew word Torah means instruction, teaching, and law. It's primarily the instruction on how to live, on what to observe in life. The Torah, as revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai according to Jewish tradition, comprises both the written and the oral Torah. The written Torah is the sacred scripture of Judaism, which consists of the 5 books of Moses, the core part of the Hebrew Bible. It plays a major role in all of Jewish life. Its text is being ritually read in synagogues from Torah scrolls, as you can see one in the picture. And in Jewish law, the Torah is considered the highest source of law. According to rabbinical teaching, Moses wrote down the text of the Torah in the following years, after it had been revealed to him as a whole on Mount Sinai. The law contained in the written Torah is explained and further expanded in oral teachings that, according to Jewish tradition, Moses received at the same time on Mount Sinai. These complementary teachings, which are referred to as the oral law or the oral Torah, were passed down orally from generation to generation in an unbroken chain until they were finally committed to writing in order to prevent them from being lost. After the Exodus, the people of Israel settled in Canaan. According to Jewish tradition, it reached the heyday of its political standing at the time of the kingdom under the kings Saul, David, and Solomon. For the history of Judaism, Solomon's reign is most significant. Solomon was the king who built the temple in Jerusalem as the central sanctuary of Judaism. After centuries of division and gradual decline, the Israelites lost their own state in the early 6th century before our time and came under foreign rule, first by the Babylonians and then by the Persians when the Babylonian Empire was conquered by Cyrus the Great of Persia. Around 587, the Babylonians had destroyed Jerusalem along with Solomon's temple and deported the Jews to Babylon, where they were to live for decades in captivity until the Persians defeated the Babylonians in 539, following which the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. With Alexander the Great's conquests, Persian rule was replaced by Greek rule, and later the whole area became part of the Roman Empire. In AD 66, a Jewish uprising broke out in the Jerusalem area. Initially, the uprising was successful in throwing the Romans out of Jerusalem and conquering other strongholds in the region. But then Rome reacted by sending its legions to crush the uprising, triggering a military campaign that ended in AD 70 with the siege and destruction of Jerusalem under the command of Titus. On the reliefs of the Titus Arch in Rome, the Roman victory is celebrated. Titus can be seen as a triumphator, followed by soldiers carrying spoils from the now definitively destroyed Jerusalem temple, including the famous golden menorah. The only remaining part of the temple is the western wall, sustaining the Temple Mount, Judaism's holiest place today. In order to prevent large-scale Jewish uprisings from happening again, the Romans also scattered the Jewish population over various provinces of their empire, thus initiating centuries of diaspora. Diaspora and the destruction of the temple posed an existential threat to Judaism. Without a center of worship and with communities scattered all over the Roman world, especially the continuity of oral traditions seemed at great risk. The longer this situation persisted, the more the danger increased. Against this background, Rabbi Judah Hanassi, the leader of the Jewish community in the Roman province of Judea, decided to address the issue by coordinating the collection and codification of the oral teachings that until then had been passed down orally from generation to generation as the oral Torah. On Judah Hanassi's initiative, these oral teachings were put in writing for the first time in order to prevent them from being lost for future generations. This written version of the oral Torah is what is referred to as the Mishnah, which literally means repetition. The Mishnah contains 66 tractates on the widest imaginable range of questions of law. All later developments in what we call Rabbinic Judaism are based on this text. With the early Arab conquests of the 7th century, Jerusalem became part of the Islamic world. Under Islamic rule, Jewish communities continued to exist in Jerusalem and other places in the Middle East. But as we have seen in part 1 of this lecture, the center of Jewish culture soon shifted to another part of the Islamic world, Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, Sepharad for the Jews. Meanwhile, there were also many Jewish communities throughout Christian Europe, However, they repeatedly became targets of persecutions, especially in the 12th and 13th centuries, the time of the Crusades, when the spirit of combating perceived enemies of Christendom in the East turned against the Jews at home as well. Furthermore, in the 14th century, Jews were often taken as scapegoats for outbreaks of Black Death epidemics. Persecution was especially intensive in Western Europe, culminating in the expulsion of Jews from England at the end of the 13th century, from France at the end of the 14th century, from Spain at the end of the 15th century, as well as from parts of Germany and Italy. As a result, most European Jews fled eastwards to Poland, taking with them their Yiddish, their language rooted in medieval German, and counting on Poland's reputation of religious tolerance. This map shows where Jewish population centers in Europe had shifted until the middle of the 18th century. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Jewish communities were increasingly confronted with European modernity. European society was undergoing profound changes due to Enlightenment, political revolutions, scientific discoveries, and industrialization. Against this background, a number of Jewish intellectuals created a Jewish version of Enlightenment, the Haskalah movement. The Haskalah movement sparked attempts at modernizing Judaism that led to the emergence of a new current within Judaism, liberal or reform Judaism, aimed at adapting the Jewish way of life and Jewish law as enshrined in the Torah to modern circumstances. In response, at the other end of the spectrum, those who wanted to hold on to the traditions as they had been loyally handed down from generation to generation formed Orthodox Judaism. Between the two opposing positions, a third intermediary current developed, conservative Judaism. And these are only the three main currents in modern Judaism. Each of them presents itself in numerous different shades, differing widely from each other as to how they interpret the law enshrined in the Torah. In addition, in the late 19th century, a modern political movement emerged, Zionism, a movement aimed at creating a national homeland for all Jewish people from around the world. Zionism is less related to Judaism than to modern politics. The egalitarian society, as it emerged from the age of revolutions, offered European Jews new opportunities. It gave them equal rights. Restrictions on the exercise of professions, which were common in earlier times, had disappeared. Many sought to take full advantage of freedom of trade and industry, and were eager to assimilate completely, which led to the formation of a new class of secularized Jews who tended to feel more European than Jewish, but were not necessarily always fully accepted within European majority society. The 19th century was a time of mounting modern nationalism with the national unification of Italy and Germany, and opposing nationalisms clashing in wars, namely in the 1870 war between Germany and France. Zionism can be regarded as a Jewish version of a secular European nationalism. The 19th century also saw the emergence of a new phenomenon, racial anti-Semitism. In the context of secular modern nationalism, Jews increasingly came to be perceived as an alien racial group that posed a risk to one's own nation. Anti-Semitic measures and persecutions were especially harsh in Tsarist Russia. Building on such elements, Zionists started to think of Jews as a nation. They argued that the only way to afford protection, security and dignity to this Jewish nation was to make sure it obtained its own national homeland. Zionism also has a Swiss connection. The first Zionist World Congress, you can see in the picture, was held in Basel, Switzerland in 1897. Here you have the program that was adopted at this conference. According to this, Zionism seeks to establish a home for Jewish people in Palestine. And in order to achieve this, a number of measures were considered, namely, 1. The promotion by appropriate means of the settlement in Palestine of Jewish farmers, artisans and manufacturers. And 3, the strengthening and fostering of Jewish national sentiment and national consciousness. Zionist settlements in Palestine began in the early 20th century with the founding of the modern European-style city of Tel Aviv. Here you have what Tel Aviv looked like in the 1930s. While the situation turned dramatic in Europe in the lead up to the Second World War and during the war with the Holocaust, the systematic annihilation of the Jews by Nazi Germany. Shortly after that catastrophe, the Zionist movement reached its objective. Modern Israel was founded in 1948. In the picture, you have David Ben-Gurion, the first Israeli prime minister, publicly proclaiming the State of Israel in Tel Aviv on the 14th of May 1948 beneath a giant portrait of Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement. But let's switch back for a moment to Judaism, to the classical Jewish worldview shared by the greatest Jewish scholars and thinkers, such as Maimonides or Rabbi Shlomo Itzhaki, who wrote the most authoritative commentary on the Talmud and who is best known by his acronym Rashi. Acronyms are frequently used in Jewish literature. Maimonides also is often referred to by his acronym Rambam. So what about the cosmological and anthropological foundations of the Jewish legal tradition? In the classical Jewish worldview, all depends on the one God, and this is true for law as well. From this perspective, the world is seen as the stage for God's creation and for history determined by God. In Judaism, the history of the people of Israel plays a central role. It is history understood as sacred history, focusing on the special relationship between the one God and his chosen people. It's a story full of tragedy, in which God tests his chosen people, punishes them for wrongdoing, forgives them again and again, and endows them with high spiritual gifts. In this understanding of history, the many tragedies that strike the people of Israel are not just endless injustices. Rather, they are seen as part of an ongoing dialogue and an expression of divine justice. Based on this worldview, human beings are primarily seen as addressees of God's commandments, the mitzvot in Hebrew, the divinely instituted rules of conduct that consist of obligations and prohibitions, positive and negative commandments. All of these commandments together form the Jewish law that is referred to as the Halakha.